Hi, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Priya Kechandani, the editor of Icon magazine. We're here at Quadrifoglio, who are our partners in this event. I'm here with Maria Cheung, who's director and head of interior design at Squire Partners, Paul Gulati, who's director at Universal Design Studio, and Shai Akram, who's co-founder of Studio Outshift. Now we're going to be discussing firstly some projects that these guys have worked on, and then we're going to be having a discussion about some of the key themes arising from those, including the growing interdisciplinarity of interior design and the hybridity of spaces that are being made today, as you'll see from some of the projects that they're going to discuss. I'm conscious that we're living in an era where interiors and the notion of interior design are evolving rapidly. At one time, interior design was probably associated with the idea of curating objects, choosing curtains, for example. I'd be really curious to know when these guys last chose a pair of curtains, but I know that their work definitely spans far further into other disciplines like, for example, interior architecture. In creating the types of spaces that these guys are working on, they're responding not only to kind of interior design, but also to a mix of kind of technological, economic, and social shifts. They're also helping shape the way that we work, defining workspaces in new ways, enabling us to live and socialize in ways that will define us in the future. Just to tell you a little bit more about the panel before we start going into their work. Firstly, Maria, as I mentioned, is head of interior design at Squire & Partners. She led the interiors team for their award-winning offices at the department store in Brixton, which involved the transformation of an old department store into an office. She's also worked on the first co-working space for the Ministry of Sound in Borough, on residential apartments and a spa at 50 St Edmunds Terrace. Her experience ranges from restaurants and bars to bespoke installations of products, and she's been on judging panels for initiatives like World of Interiors News and Blueprint Awards, and contributed to events about workspace design by Property Week and Mix Interiors. Thank you, Maria. Paul, from Universal Design Studio, is an expert in leading complex multifunctional interior and architecture projects. For example, one that's just not too far from here is the Ace Hotel in Shoreditch. He's worked with numerous cultural institutions like the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, and the British Library. And he's also designed really interesting retail spaces for brands like Mulberry, and worked on hospitality projects such as Hoi Polloi, the restaurant. Paul's also completed numerous flexible workplace projects, which I think he's going to tell us a bit more about, and interiors for a new development for British Land at Broadgate. And last but not least, Shai Akram is co-founder with Andrew Haythornthwaite of Studio Outshift. They are a design studio for material research and the production of space and objects. They use narrative as a means to initiate briefs and explore ideas through a kind of process-led material investigation, and Shai combines her practice with academia. She works with clients across the entire process of design, from concept to production and installation. Some of her work includes the Book Club, Chin Chin Laboratories, and SKN Gallery, and their work has been acquired by some interesting museum collections like the Design Museum and MoMA. Thank you so much. We have such a distinguished panel. We're very lucky. To start off with, Maria, it would be great to talk through some of your projects. I'm going to just do a bit of a slide shift. So, the first one we have here is the department store. Would you like to tell us a bit about working on this?
So this was a big challenge for us as the interiors team. Squire & Partners is actually a practice of 250 designers and architects and designers, and designing our new home was quite a challenge. We have, you can imagine, 250 designers looking over our shoulders, kind of going, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And so the whole thing really started off with us finding the place. The partners had actually gone on quite a long trail to find the department store, and they looked at lots of different buildings. We had one criteria from our head, Michael Squire, said that it has to be on the Victoria line. And so Brixton, that's where we ended up. And this building, which they described as is a bit of a dog when we first got there, actually turned out to be quite a beauty. When we first got there, it was derelict. It had been squatted in. It wasn't until we started stripping out that we realised that we had actually some really beautiful remnants of the old building, and actually quite a lot of it was preserved, but quite a lot of it was hidden under lots of layers of paint and layers of carpet, which covered beautiful mahogany, 100-year-old mahogany floors. So the first part of the project was really about excavation and actually finding out what we really had. And then once we saw the beauty of what was there, we decided we had to make lots of decisions about how we curated it. How much did we leave? How much would we actually restore? Very little is actually what we really did in the end, but what feature do we want to enhance? And we really embraced the concept of the department store. It was the original department store extension to the Bon Marché, which was next door. So 1906 was when this building was actually created for the furnishing department for the Bon Marché. And so already we inherited some really beautiful structures, beautiful coffers, beautiful columns, beautiful column details. And so it's really about us kind of like really celebrating those pieces and then adding our new interventions. And we were very mindful of actually anything that we created new had a reference to the existing building. And so very early on, we had Ila Koshimoto who came with us. They were friends of ours already, and they walked around, and with Wakako's brilliant mind and eyes, she kind of saw things that were beautiful and created a series of patterns for us. So anywhere that we added new openings or new creations, we actually had their pattern and motif put on, which was a reflection of what the building had already. And so the narrative of the department store really kind of continued, and actually it made a lot of sense for how Squire & Partner was actually growing as a company. We already had a fantastic model shop department. We already had CGI illustration, which we were beginning to have. Our interiors team was kind of really developing. And so we realized that actually we had lots of different departments within our company already. And so to keep the name of the department store actually really start to embrace and explain to the world actually what we're about now. We're not just architects. We're architects and interior designers, product makers, installation makers, great thinkers, and really celebrating it. And a big part of the what we didn't have at King's Cross, which we were at for 15 years, is actually this new shop front. And we thought that actually we should really embrace the shop front to actually put to the heart of what we do. And the workshop, what the guys do at the model shop, really kind of was celebrated. But we really put them on the shop front. They really now, from our King's Cross basement, which they had a tiny space, and it's amazing that actually produced all the models that they did, to now that it's like they have the largest floor area in the whole of the ground floor. We were also incredibly mindful that us as a company moving to Brixton, we were 250 people. That's a big workforce to suddenly deliver to Brixton. And so our PR team worked tirelessly to actually make sure that we secured connections with the community. So throughout the build, we were very mindful that actually we wanted to engage the local community. And so for the 18 months we had hoarding around, it coincided with 2 Brixton design trails. And so for for 2 of those design trails, we actually used our hoarding to invite artists to put their artwork up as part of the design trail. We kind of tried to link artists with people that were known to us. So we would know, of course, like tile companies like Domus, who would supply art materials for artists to make their kind of mosaic curation, and it was all curated so that our shop front was being used. And then later on, as we were about to start revealing bits of our building, we kind of created skate ramps and invited people to graffiti all over our building. There's a lot to say, but I'd say the whole project was a huge collaboration between a lot of people, the local community, us as designers, and also all the people through Squire & Partners history, as people who've made furniture, provided lighting for us, and we invited them to work on our project as a showcase for them as well, because we had always had this vision that it would be a space where people can come in and show off their work. So the lighting, we worked with Floss and Atrium, who we work with a lot in our company for various different projects. All the furniture has been made by companies that we work with already, and wherever possible we try and find collaborations. And I think if you go to the building, you'll see lots of very different pieces, but they come together because it's actually got, I think, our heart in it, and actually everyone who's come and worked with us has put a piece of their soul into the building. And we're very happy to say that they still do come round and use it as a showroom as well.
it's a really beautiful project, one of the most beautiful architectural projects in London, I think, in the last year or two. Really remarkable, I think, because of the way it retains a kind of faithfulness to the original architecture, but then injects it with this modernity, which is really, that contrast is really striking. How did you achieve that balance? Like, how did you negotiate the kind of neat desire to create something new with the preservation of what was already there?
Yeah, so we were really strict with our palette. Right at the beginning, we found there was a green, a verdigris green that was in the columns and in the walls that we were peeling back, we were sanding back, and we could find this green, and we thought, well, green is definitely a natural colour in this building. And it really coincided with the extension that we built, which is a copper roof, which of course naturally patinates to a green colour. Throughout, we've used copper in the building. So I'd like to say that we only have 2 new materials, which is copper in its patinated form and in its natural form, as in the raw kind of the copper colour you see, and then ply, which is in its black. We've stained it black, or it's in our furniture, which is in its the birch ply finish. So wherever we have new interventions, we would use those materials, and that's we were trying to be as strict as possible with that. So our lift fronts that we kind of created were in those finishes, and then wherever there's an existing wall, we would kind of like strip back to reveal the kind of the paintwork. And it ended up being quite an art, and we had to take our contractors with us along this journey, because you can imagine we would see, I mean, if you imagine a wall that's been painted with layers and layers of paint, at which point do you think that's right and it's done? And it took us a little while to understand how much we want to achieve in terms of standing back, and eventually we got our contractors to understand. But there were quite a period of time where we would be on site almost every day going, stop sanding, right, let's put a sticker on this wall, and there'd be an A4 piece of paper saying, this wall's complete, do not stand anymore.
Wow.
And it was literally wall by wall that we did that. And we were trying to push ourselves to actually imagine how raw could we leave the building. So there are parts of it when we were walking around going, I think that's a bit scary, it looks as though it might fall down. Do you think, our clients coming in would kind of go, wow, I don't feel safe in this room. And then actually, if you put a little coffer over that patch of wall and you leave the edges raw, actually it works. And I think so there was a series of experimentation for us as well. But in terms of, we were trying to really limit our palette, and we really kind of like the colour and the richness really comes from the existing building, and what we put in is very clean and kind of quite minimal.
I mean, obviously the objects that you put in the interior, the furniture and so on, had to then fit with what was this existing structure that you decided to leave relatively raw, as you said. Yeah. How did you source like objects and furniture, and how did you go about it?
So we actually did quite a bit of research on the period of building when we imagined, when it was a department store, what furniture would it have sold. So we went back to history to look through the pieces and the times that we would have made. And actually then we were talking to Carl Hansen quite a lot, and actually we do have a lot of pieces from Carl Hansen, because actually we found a real resonance with the company, and they are incredibly into their craftsmanship, and they're really respectful of their materials, and the people who work there are really well treated, and so there was a synthesis there. And then we also realised that actually quite a lot of the pieces, particularly in the reception area that you see in the image, there were pieces there that was designed exactly at the same time. So we imagined that some of those pieces would have been sold at that time, and so that was for us the starting point of where we wanted the furniture to go. We tried to bring back as many of the pieces that we were in our King's Cross office, because we already had space for 250 people, although we were incredibly cramped. There was already lots of furniture there, so we brought all our chairs over. We tried to, and the existing tables. We had some beautiful Fritz Hansen tables, which were white melamine top, which completely suited our King's Cross office, but didn't quite go with the aesthetic of the department store. So actually, with our joinery company, we put a layer of black melamine, lino rather, on the top, and actually that swung it. So we tried to, I think we, in the end, only left 3 meeting tables, which no one owned up to actually specifying originally.
Wow. So you had to be quite ruthless about what to keep and what to get rid of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think there's one more image here. Do you want to tell us about this specific space within the project?
So this is the dome, which was the last piece of the puzzle. We had a lot of ideas about what this space could be at the beginning of our design process, and for a while it was going to be. I think I'd just come back from the Alexander McQueen exhibition and was so inspired by it. We kind of went, oh, we need that room of curiosity that he has in there.
Oh, so it's just the best room ever in an exhibition.
And so we were like, right, let's just do a room of curiosities. And as a company, we seem to acquire a lot of very curious objects. And why? Because we go on a crazy work trip every year, and we kind of always go fancy dress. And so as a creation for these fancy dress parties, we create a lot of very crazy objects, and we bring back quite a lot. And so we kind of thought this could be a space where our fancy dress objects are, and all the curiosities that we acquire as a group of people. And that was kind of like left till the end, when, well, actually, no, let's just wait because we're not really sure, and actually we needed to open the rest of the building. That wasn't the priority. And then we kind of got to a point where we'd opened our members' areas upstairs, and the restaurant was doing really well, and we realised there was a real demand for actually spaces for hire. And that's where we kind of went, actually, the dome, particularly because we put the glass dome on top, is actually a really beautiful space in the evening. And so we thought, actually, a space for dining for 12 to 14 people was perfect there. And so we created the dome space, which is, sometimes I like to use it as my private office, but
wow, not bad.
But that doesn't very often happen. It's only when meeting rooms are not free. But it's really a dining space, and we used on the table there. During the process of construction, we salvaged a lot of timbers from the building, and we got them sliced into a radial veneer. So although it's only pine, but stained, it's actually over 100 years old, and it's from the building.
Wow.
Yeah, so really kind of like we're just trying to keep within the things that we have within the building, and the language that we developed for the furniture in our model shop, which is actually really simple scaffolding poles, and that's the furniture that we have on most of the ground floor model shop and our making room. We thought, well, let's just add a little bit of twist to it, so we use copper pipes instead, and so actually our workshop made all the pieces of furniture that you can see on the side, and then the curtain really was just to add softness, and actually when it's all closed, it's rather beautiful as well.
So you have chosen curtains at some point in your career.
Yes, actually,
it's not a fiction.
It's not a fiction, and actually, curtains we're discovering is incredibly useful device, and I think it's
interesting.
I'm totally into curtains, and yeah, I think, and we've used it very successfully in the Ministry of Sound workspace as well.
Thank you so much. Okay. Such a fascinating project. Moving on to Universal Design Studio, Paul, I know you're going to talk us through some kind of examples of the use of hybridity in your work, and we're starting with the At6 Hotel, which is in Stockholm, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. At6 was completed last year, beginning of last year, for Nordic Choice. It's in downtown Stockholm, if you can term it like that. It's an area of the city that was a bit unloved. It's in a Brutus building, a 1970s building, and obviously completely transformed now, previously a bank. And I guess the reference to hybridity is that it's a project that was conceived of as almost a kind of overlay of an art gallery, if you like, because there's some serious pieces of artwork in there. There's a Richard Long at the top of the stairs, Jean Plenser sculpture on the stair. And rather than, I guess, what sometimes happens in projects where the artwork is a kind of superimposition at the end, we worked closely with the curator throughout so that the architecture, the design of the spaces was developed in tandem with bringing those artists on board and working with them. And in this case, the head by Jean Plenser, the same stone is used for the staircase, so it's very much embedded into the space.
So presumably that was a new commission for this space?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting also for us is the idea of taking, in this particular case, taking artwork out of the traditional idea of a white box gallery. The idea that it might be read, conceived of, perceived differently in spaces that are activated for different functions. Essentially a hospitality space. People are eating and drinking and meeting and working and probably proposing marriage and other things that people do in hotels, right next to pieces of artwork, which is contextually quite different from a traditional gallery space. So in that sense, it's a kind of hybrid of, I guess, it's a cultural space and it's very much a commercial space. It's a hotel.
So in this particular case, how did the relationship between the interior design and the artist work? I guess conventionally, the architect an interior designer would design the space, and then perhaps the art would be an afterthought to a degree, and it would then be selected and curated, etc. Not without thought, but to work within the existing structure. And you've said this is kind of a different approach.
Yeah,
so
I guess it was different in that the curator was one of the key stakeholders on the client side. So they have a curator as part of Nordic Choice Hotels who works on other projects. And right at the outset, I think there was a discussion about could this be a bit more of a interweaved hybrid approach to integrating the artwork within the spaces rather than that kind of overlay at the end. Sometimes there's a piece of work that might go into the project, but often there's not that dialogue to that level and to that depth. And we've been working with Frieze to do the art fairs, so we had a real good opportunity to invite different artists and the curator over to start that discussion even before the project was really properly up and going. So the idea that art is integrated in a very particular way into the interior spaces was dealt with from the outset, I guess.
So in that particular case, with the material used, was that determined by the architect or by the artist, or? It was
a dialogue. So there was a kind of feedback. For sure, we had to do something that you could also sculpt.
Yeah, because this is marble, presumably.
Yeah, but I guess if you look at it, it needs to be a kind of a hard material that picks up detail. I mean, the nosing of a staircase needs to be a hard material that picks up detail. So there's already the possibility that could transfer between something that's used for an art object and something that's used for a kind of architectural feature.
It's really interesting. It gives the space a kind of sculptural quality that goes well beyond the sculpture, in a sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. No, good. Glad you think that.
So the next project, Mini Living.
Entirely different. So this is some work we've been doing with Mini, the car brand, who are owned by BMW, based in Munich, and they're exploring new ways of, I guess, extending the brand. So I think of Mini as small, urban, kind of well-designed, certainly in its original form. It's a kind of icon. And actually, if you think about some of the challenges of city living, the need for kind of small, compact, well-designed spaces, there seems to be kind of almost a natural transference of some of that thinking into possibilities into this new area of shared co-living, if you like. So they had this they were exploring this as a product, as a new idea, the Mini Living brand, and we came on board as they had a site with a developer in Shanghai. So this is a project for Shanghai that we're working on at the moment. It's going to complete next year. So this is the first manifestation of that.
So this is a series of essentially micro homes, is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a hybrid also between architecture and interior. So we're building an architectural framework around what are essentially two existing buildings. They were paint workshops before. So there's a little bit of kind of, adaptation and reuse. And within those main existing volumes, it's pretty much all carved up on the upper floors into co-living, shared spaces. So they're small rooms, and then some of the rooms open out. I mean, there's more. That's the only image that I have. But some of those rooms open out, and there's a sharing of spaces in a way that can only work for some people at a certain point in their life, shall we say.
I mean, clearly this project's not at completed stage yet, but do you envisage designing for like smaller spaces, inevitably for urban environments, being different to the way that you've designed other types of spaces like hotels, which are much larger?
Well, I suppose in some ways there's almost a similarity in the footprint. You've got the essentials, the bed, a shower room, and you might have a place to prepare something really simple in terms of food and drink, which you can kind of do in some hotel rooms anyway. But I think but what it shares with hotels is, I think great hotels are often about, all right, the room is really, really key. It's probably the most important thing. But it's also about the amenity spaces, the lobby, the kind of, I suppose you can even say the community aspect of a hotel, because hotels do have a community aspect, particularly something like Ace, I guess, where it brings people in from the outside. It's not just about the transient. There's an overlap with with people from the local community.
Definitely in the case of lobbies and restaurants and things like that.
And I think this shares that in the sense that it's about all of those shared spaces, those community spaces, the places where you'll probably spend, hopefully, more of your time engaging with others before you go back to your room.
Studio Outshift, we've got a couple of your projects which I think characterise your sort of quite distinctive aesthetic. Firstly, this is a space called Patterns. Can you tell us like where it is? Firstly,
it's in Brighton.
In Brighton, okay.
It's in Brighton on the seafront. It's in a site that used to be called Audio a long time ago. It was kind of an institution of raves and musicality, and it was right on the waterfront. And there was a secret passage that went from the sea into the building. It used to be a hotel a long time ago, and when we arrived on site, it was this kind of one of those bars where you see those purple wallpaper with the golden damask pattern and the chrome light shades all the way across.
Nice.
And we were a bit like, this is quite different to what we normally do, but the brief was like a dream brief. They basically said, we'd like this place to be able to stand up to a hardcore party, but also host a very nice wedding. And we would like it to reference musicality, and we just want it to be habitable in every possible way. We'd like people who come to Brighton to imagine this is like their holiday home. Very brave clients who let us do a lot with the space.
I mean, we're talking about hybridity and so on. How did you cater for that brief in the sense that there were so many facets that they wanted to be used for a wedding as well as like essentially a club, it sounds like?
It gets very, very full of people dancing on the tables, on the terraces, and so what we thought about was materials that wear well, but we also really wanted to reference the fact that it's right next to the beach. So there's a lot of, we took asphalt onto the flooring, because a lot of the time in a lot of the bars and restaurants we've designed, it's the floor that tells its age first. And we thought where stands up to constant use more than the road. So we worked with an asphalt company and we made our own custom mix that is just for Patterns, a particular mix of pebbles that were ground back, and that floor can stand up to anything. There's been Pride in there, then the next weekend there was a lovely wedding, and it always looks the same, always nice and shiny, but we programmed the space as a way of, instead of thinking of it as this is a zone and this is the only thing that's going to happen there, so we're kind of going to optimize it by having furniture that only just allows those things. Everything was kind of open for invitation. So the terracing along the side, it's got leather pads on that you can inhabit quite easily during the day for a chat or, or even for brunch. But at night that becomes kind of like a place where people are dancing. There's a DJ standing at the front. There's those speakers, the flying speakers that move across the space, depending on whether it's a DJ or a band playing on that platform. And it's just, it kind of shifts the moods, but it's not one of those complicated unfolding spaces that you sometimes see in small living apartments. It just expands and contracts depending on what's happening within the space.
So, I mean, we talked a bit in the case of Maria about working within an existing building. How did you approach that? You talked about the context and trying to reflect the fact this was by the sea. How did you deal with the existing architecture?
Well, the existing architecture, because it had been a hotel, and then they'd kind of changed the way that the hotel was used, and there was extra stairways kind of sellotaped onto the side, and nothing really flowed very well. They had 3 different stairways connecting the terrace, the basement, the toilets, and the first floor. And they also had lots of different toilet blocks, which is not very efficient, and funny little dog leg rooms that don't really work well for a hotel, but not really when you want a whole space. So we used 2 main strategies. We gutted the building and we completely reprogrammed how the spaces connected to each other. So the stairwell became like a core that led you down into the club or up into the ground floor bar, and connected also the terrace. It was like a loop, and consolidated the toilets, but we also used mirrors quite a lot.
Oh, wow.
So that when you walked in, you would be able to see around the corner that in the L-shaped room, who was sitting there, was it empty, was it busy, did it look interesting? But also while you were sitting there, you could see who's coming in, what's going on at the bar, because it's a bar, it's for the nighttime, it's for, it's for cheekiness. So there was also above the bar, we had a huge inspired by security mirrors that have the dome, so you can see all the way around the room. We had one of those, but we worked with a company that makes the dish ends for the back of petrol lorries, the big metal dishes, and we've got that mirror polished stainless hanging from the ceiling, so you could see all the way around. And we didn't expect, because we're really into mythology and story in space, and we really thought it would be lovely if there was a kind of a landmark, and it became known as a selfie dome, and everyone was standing underneath taking a picture of themselves because it encompassed the whole environment. So
did you self-consciously create that as a kind of Instagram moment,
we thought
or not?
Not as an Instagram thing, but landmarks are very important for us in terms of stories, and there's always got to be these anchors that the story kind of pivots around, and we just thought that would be something nice to have in a place that was for these occasions, because it's for particular gig nights, and it's for particular events, and it's for weddings, and it's for those sorts of things. So we thought it would be nice to have a way to capture that.
Yeah. Okay, can we move on and discuss one more?
Stories was another really nice project with another really brave client who just trusted us. They asked us to create a space. It was on Broadway Market, but now the building's been knocked down.
So this is another multi-purpose space, is that right? It's kind of a co-working space as well as being a cafe, or?
It's a brunchy, co-working, cocktails in the evening space. The thing is that we really tried to work with atmosphere in this space. Instead of having things that moved and shifted, we thought that the way to make it shift from being like a place that feels like a library in the day that you might be working in to being something a bit more intimate at night, we worked a lot with lighting. So those folded sheet metal lights. I might add that we almost always design our own furniture because we engage a lot with materials.
Does that include lighting?
Yes, we made those, and we made the bench seats and the bar stools. We were playing with, at that time, we were obsessed with folded metal and how structural it becomes when you just put one fold in it. So
you can see that kind of structural approach feeding through every element of the interior. I guess that's because you guys tackle every element yourself.
Well, that's the joy, really, of being a smaller studio that looks after everything, because there's nothing in there that we haven't personally sourced or made, and the seat pads on the back are all different colours because it was supposed to be a place where creatives would come to work during the day. And we were thinking about how we work, and when we're speaking to clients, we're often pointing around the room saying, that kind of colour, but in that kind of finish, and the floor has got lots of different coloured tiles, and the walls are covered in all these different fabrics, and there's matte, gloss, satin, and it's kind of a living swatch book. So that's another one of the stories. That's just an example of how the story feeds into all the details. And the folded metal lights, they come down in the evening to make kind of more intimate pools of light, and they go up. There's hand winches and cables going across the ceiling. So it's quite a dynamic space.
It's quite interesting because we talked about interdisciplinarity in terms of the hybrid function of a space, but there's also, of course, interdisciplinarity in terms of approaching all these different elements of an interior. So how do you acquire the skill of being a furniture maker, being a lighting designer, as well as being an interior architect of sorts?
Well, I guess it all starts with a lot of making, and where my background is architecture first, but then I did design products at the Royal College, which is all about what can be a product of design thinking. So you end up really with an approach rather than a material discipline. And I think that we both me and my partner, we run the studio together. That's where our background is. And I think for me in particular, narrative is the way to define a brief. And I really think when you have a strong brief, you can make decisions about everything. And that, to me, is what design is. It's making decisions like, should it be this or should it be that? Well, obviously, for this story to work, it has to be this. Otherwise, there's not really any reason why you should have this chair or that chair. And I feel like brief writing is one of our strengths in the studio. And just to add for the kind of hybrid spaces, in the back, can you see that there's like a cactus in the background?
Is that a kind of garden, or is there a skylight?
There's a skylight above it, and there's we made a kind of a circular bench around it, and that was for all the mums that go up and down Broadway Market to have a cosy place where they could just go and feed their children. But it got repurposed in the evenings so the local DJs would come with their portable decks, and they'd just sit there handing out all going through the records together, having drinks, talking about, listen to this record and listen to that.
No way.
It became like this really nice hub, and I think that's what I mean by habitability that if you make it like almost like a blank canvas where anything can happen, sometimes anything does. And that's
amazing.
I love it when we hear about these other uses for spaces.
Great, thank you so much. We've heard from, I guess, the three quite different practices, each have quite a distinctive approach in their own way and really rich work. So thank you so much for talking us through them. We've eaten into a discussion time a little bit, but the work was so interesting, I didn't want to cut it short. But it would be good to just stop for a moment and talk about a few things. One is the notion of interior design. I think I mentioned at the outset, we conventionally sort of associated it with choosing curtains, and I've been proven right and wrong in the sense that
important part.
It's an important component, but of course it's just one facet of envisaging how an entire space will come together. How do you define this discipline today? Do you see yourself as interior architects? Do you see yourselves as something else? Furniture makers. How do you define your practice? Yeah.
It's actually a very interesting point because when we started the interiors team, as a concept, we were really questioning ourselves, well, are we interior designers? And actually then kind of about 8 years ago, we'd kind of go, but we don't want to be labelled as cushion design, selecting cushions and, exactly how the stereotypical in idea of what a interior designer is. And we kind of quite quickly turned to the point where actually we are designers, and it's really important that, we have a shared understanding for us as a practice, particularly that we are so strong in our architecture. And it kind of almost pains us to actually have to separate the two. The architecture and interiors are separate, but actually in completely intrinsically tied together. And it goes beyond architecture and interior. It goes to the landscape, everything we touch, all the products, especially as you're describing that actually the furniture that you sit on, I think is about space. It's neither interior or exterior or products, or it's actually about your experiential, your experience through space and actually how you come across, how you as a person interact with all of these. So I think there is no boundaries. It shouldn't be defined as one discipline or another. I think a great designer has a good range and you should be able to influence all of that. Of course, you'll be better at some things and not, because if you're specializing in exterior, actually there's so much mastery in every part of this. But as a good designer, I think you need to be involved and understand every part.
Our studio, we talk about ourselves as architects and interior designers. I think the way we're set up is that everything is kind of overlapped and merged. So sometimes people forget who's come from an architecture background, who's come from an interior design background within the studio, and which is really nice. I mean, so I've worked on projects where I've had an interior designer working on a facade element. We don't do huge, big buildings. It's often refurbishment of buildings. And vice versa, I had an architect working on an interior element, because I think the studio's about really, I guess, all of that overlap.
Are you from an architecture or interiors background?
I'm an architect.
You are?
Yeah, I'm an architect. And I joined about 15 years ago after I saw, when Universal, I think the first project was Stella McCartney's store, I saw something in that, a kind of level of detail that once I kind of delved further, I realised it. Edward Barber and Jay Oscarby, as product designers who had come from an architecture background. Actually, Ed had studied interior design, and Jay, there's a crossover. They met at the RCA, and I thought there was something fascinating about that, because I felt that in terms of my own skill set, I was really lacking in focusing on that level of detail. And so really the studio explores that in many ways. It's come out of a product design studio. So that idea of interdisciplinary work is embedded really right from the outset. And so there isn't really we don't see it as a kind of department within a practice. We combine those things. We did have a product design worker with us as well, and we don't at the moment. But we don't create standalone products. So we do make the difference. We'll create bespoke things like lighting or furniture for a project, but not something that we then manufacture. That's not something that our studio is about at the moment. The other thing I would say is that if you look at design schools or education, it's only quite recent that interior design as a course, if you like, has come about. Before it was all architecture, and that was just one aspect of architecture. The interiors were another part of architecture, and a lot of architects get into doing larger stuff based on doing interiors to start with, and others go the other way around. So it's all fascinating to me because I feel like we're right in the middle of that kind of.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I guess I'm from more of a design background, also for RCA, yeah, it's been interesting to see a shift among designers who are starting to work in what I would have defined as architecture, because but it's actually kind of a form of interior design. For example, I went to Patricia Urquiola's studio in Milan, and she, half her staff are pretty much architects, and that's a real shift because there was sort of more of a boundary, I think, in the past between design on the one hand, architecture on the other, but there seems to be a lot more working between the two disciplines now. Another term that I think we really need to interrogate following your presentations was the idea of function. There are bars being used as wedding venues and hotel lobbies that double up as galleries. How do you grapple with this idea of function? Presumably your clients come to you saying, we want to build an office or something like that, a hotel. So how do you negotiate that and try to broaden out the idea of functionality?
Usually our clients are not that specific. They're normally small independents, and we've had briefs as broad as we just would like this place to be busy from 8 a.m. to 3 a.m. and it's up to us to figure it out.
Do you have
it's
to
really nice.
Do you have to write the business strategy as well, or?
Well, luckily we just normally make suggestions, and they normally deal with the programming. But if we kind of normally work with a life cycle like a story, and say these are the activities that can happen, and we kind of approach it like a huge Venn diagram, and like what the things that live in the overlaps between these, because that will make it all work. I guess that's how we approach those sorts of briefs, because nothing should be, the constraint shouldn't be something that limits the design. It should be something that makes it ultra specific and special to that place, and it couldn't exist in any other site for any other client at any other time. That's how we would approach changing a brief that changes throughout the day.
I guess workplace design is one particular area that is becoming a lot broader in terms of function, with the introduction of flexible working, homes becoming workplaces. How have you seen the idea of the workplace interior shift during your careers?
I mean, I think for us it's been huge. I think in our current kind of 5-10 years, it's the shift has been massive, and I think. And it's all good, because I think it's a real understanding actually of how people are working, and actually thinking about there are people working at different times. And I completely agree with the kind of the shift when we were designing the Ministry of Sound. We were trying to work out exactly the same. It's like, we need to occupy this building from 7 till 12:30 at night. How can you make this space work? And actually we did exactly the same. So let's go, okay, who's coming in at 7:30 for their morning coffee? But it's also understanding that actually how people want to work. They don't want to necessarily work in a soulless office. They want to go somewhere they feel at home with, and they feel relaxed. And there's different offerings for there. And that's the biggest shift I can see, that from the offices that we have been doing for developers, which you'll have your BCO guide, you'll have, of course, your showers, your bike stores. That's kind of almost the absolute minimum that you need to provide nowadays. And it has been for a long time. But increasingly we're going, well, actually, you know what? Maybe people want a gym. Yeah. Maybe people want some space that they can break out in. And people are beginning to understand how they might lease these spaces differently as well. That instead of actually going into an empty shell Cat-A fit out, they might kind of say, well, actually, if I go to someone like WeWorks or Workspace or any of these big brands, I have spaces that are created for me already. There's a service. And I think the service level is actually a really key point. The actual, the service that you provide. And by that I mean kind of, you'll have coffee, tea at on tap, and that, and someone bringing that to you. Someone cleans your office, and all of those things are just kind of like add-ons to what makes us work our spaces better. And of course, there's a huge part of wellness that's definitely on everyone's kind of hit list at the moment, of actually the things that you really need. Basement offices are no longer okay. We need light, we need greenery, we need fresh air, and I think is a really great thing, I think, that we're seeing now, because we're all working, and it's important that actually the amount of time that we spend in our office are reflected by the space that's available to us.
I mean, who would have thought the Ministry of Sound would have wanted to create a co-working space a decade ago, right?
Yeah.
Is that what this project was? Because just to give some context.
Yes, so this is Ministry of Sound's first co-working spaces, and they're hoping to. This is the first one, and they're going to hopefully create more. So it was amazing for us as well. And at the beginning, there was a lot of conversation with the clients, like, how much of the ministry characteristic do you want to bring to this? Like, are we actually just making a big dance floor or a big club space? And what we kind of really got, and it was a lot of working with the client to actually work out what the brief was. And whether we even use the name ministry at all, or should it be something completely different? And what we did really kind of get from lots of workshops, was actually that we wanted to get the DNA of the ministry, this kind of like this rebellious streak into it. But we also understood that actually you had to provide very comfortable space. So probably unlike a lot of other workspaces, there's very high focus on the F&B, and the ground floor really does transform into a dance floor. We designed it so there's two halves of the bar.
Oh, really? So there is a workplace stroke bar thing going on?
Oh, yes.
Cool.
At the evenings and weekends, it does kind of like the tables and chairs gets pulled back, and it is a dance floor. The DJ booth is there. And I think, there's kind of elements. It was the longest bar in the whole of London. It's 22-metre long copper bar that we made for them.
Although, do we want to spend that long in the office?
Well, because you've got the floors above, and naturally those spaces are different. I think you can come down and,
Okay.
It's a good question whether you want to be coming there at the weekends and clubbing as well. I mean, it's not quite club, but there's definitely dancing going on there in the evenings.
Would anyone like to ask our panel anything? Really lucky to have these guys here today, so please use this opportunity.
Hi. It's probably not so much interiors, but I was interested about what Maria said about the shop front idea, because one thing that recently we actually heard was about, it's been going on for about over 10 years, it's like the dying high street, and also like the functional spaces and how it's changing so much, and how there is actually a lot of restrictions on what councils are allowing people to do with certain spaces. So how do you work with these challenges? Like you said in Shanghai, you had an old factory, and converting that, you had the department store, and that's on a high street. So what are the challenges that you face with this sort of conversion and laws and the government?
Well, I was going to say, I think there's more flexibility, because I think people realise, in local government, that you want spaces and places to have a kind of life, and maybe there's a shift in terms of the function. So something that was previously a business area needs to allow for more residential, and vice versa, because the city's completely changing. Always, it's constantly in flux. And I think you find those parts of cities and towns and places where you get this convergence of different functions coming together, or things become rethought of. Trying to think of like somewhere like Redchurch Street that would have had businesses on it, and then at one point had, there was a shop where Tracy Emin and Sarah Lucas were making artwork out of it, and now it's all just really expensive shops again. That's a good idea, a good way of looking at a cycle that happens. And so I think, legislation, local government, if they're open to it and they see the opportunity, that's great. Things like Peckham Levels, that's no longer a car park. I think it's fantastic. The challenges that you have, and I think the opportunities really, because the challenges, the opportunities are, as designers, interior designers, architects, is to think about other functions that perhaps aren't part of the brief. I think that's really that sort of strategic thinking where you are being asked to do one thing, and you go, actually, obviously you don't want to turn it completely in your head. So we want a hotel. Oh, well, actually, we're doing your workspace. That doesn't quite work like that. But if you maybe, we did a workspace. One of the images I put on there in Vauxhall in Tintagel House, and there was an apartment, a suite at the top of it. It was a leftover space we didn't know what to do with, because it was a roof area that previously had plant on it, so it had big concrete upstand beams, and you couldn't really, it wasn't big enough to make into a proper meeting room. So we thought, let's put a sunken bath in between those concrete beams, and we'll put a bed over there, and we might as well put a meeting table over there so you can use it as a meeting room, but you could also stay in it. An existing building offers you that opportunity to or we could have just made it a storage space, a back of house space, but that wouldn't have been as much fun. And so I think refurbishing buildings and rethinking new possibilities is, I think, one of the fun things.
You could run a meeting from the back, couldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. And I think someone's probably done it, and I probably wouldn't want to be in there when that's happening.
Any more questions? Yes, one at the back.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering how you would kind of relate the rise of sort of of scenography and the design of kind of more temporary spaces and all to do with fashion and so forth. How you would kind of relate that to the expansion of design into actually in a different direction into kind of the art world, and design as pieces of art that cost huge amounts of money and are shown in Basel and that sort of thing. And just I feel like those things are kind of related but different, and yeah. Don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting. It's happening a lot. I think, but the art world is shifting a lot, and it has done throughout the 20th century. Kind of taking on different mediums. So naturally, there's a natural overlap between space, scenography, as you say it. So I think again, that's just as you were referring to it. It's just another way of looking at space.
Yeah,
so these are other mediums, and artists naturally are interested in the idea of space because it allows you to, I guess, tell different stories and make different connections and engagements.
Yeah, and I guess the kind of area of scenography is also broadening out in the way that interior design has. So I think people that would have considered themselves scenographers are now likewise sort of forms of architects in a sense. So if you look at the work of like Es Devlin, she's building she's making entire buildings for like the stage sets of people like Beyonce and Miley Cyrus and stuff, as well as working in a more artistic level within galleries, like her recent thing at the Pitzanger. So I think that there's, again, much more interdisciplinarity that's enabling this sort of more artistic approach within a scenography context and vice versa. So I think that's partly what it is. But I think there's also like a greater level of ambition, maybe technically that's just more physically possible now in set design. But, if you look at the Fashion Week sets now, the collaborations and the ambition is another level compared to a few decades ago. So I think kind of the fact that set design has been sort of accepted as a sort of artistic discipline has enabled it to be more artistically ambitious.
Yeah, and perhaps there's the role of the designer as an author and having a voice, whereas before I think, especially your description of an interior designer before, where it's like someone makes a mood board and it is in the style of, because there's so many times I say that we design furniture and spaces and people ask me, oh, what's your style? And it's, well, it's not really a style. And they're, are you Rococo? Are you? It's like, not really. And I think that the permission to have authorship in spaces and to say something through spaces and to say something through furniture or through the way you approach materials, it's not the same as art, obviously, but it's still a statement and it's still a position that you're taking in the objects that you're making.
I think it's a sort of postmodern position that you're taking in a sense, because you're saying, I'm not Rococo, I am not minimalist. It's sort of a hybridity in itself, which is sort of a postmodern statement. Yeah. Any last burning questions that we haven't had time? Hi. Sure, go for it.
Thank you all for all your very interesting discussion points. I think kind of on the back of what we were just talking about, and just the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary nature of all of these projects these days, I'm just curious about what you expect from the designers and architects that you work with. So when you get a very broad brief and you're assembling a team to work on a project, do you expect them to be multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary or thinking that way? Or is it better to kind of get specialists in an area? And how much is it, like, I guess, are you working with your internal team or bringing in outside specialists when you need them?
I'm assuming this approach is going to vary quite broadly. I guess Shai has told us about kind of chipping in on everything in a sense, but in a larger practice, this must be more relevant, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, we go at it like we always start with the concept that's incredibly important for us, and actually understanding, very much as Shai says, actually what's the narrative of this story, and then we create the canvas, and then because we've been so fortunate to work with so many really great people, that we kind of immediately think of certain people that we want to work with. So, for instance, in this particular view, which is the vanity area of the Ministry of Sound, we wanted to create this quite crazy space which you don't really quite understand. So we had these faceted mirrors, and we kind of thought, how can we add more embellishment to it? So we kind of invited an artist who worked with us before at a department store, Karolina Merska, who is actually kind of like long keeping the Polish craft of pająkis, which is what that is. But we kind of said, but you know what? We're also specifying this chair from Patricia Akimola in the bathroom, and it's got some really great colours in it. Do you think we can work with that together? And then we actually tried to get Morosso to send over the cords, which then we could actually use to make the pająkis. And so it's just kind of like little ideas like that, and suddenly you start a conversation, and then before you know it, Karolina Merska is talking to Morosso, and we're trying to get these cords from Senegal, and it didn't unfortunately quite work in the end, but we managed to get the colour scheme to coordinate. And I think it's just about seeking those opportunities, and I think without, we could never say we created all our spaces by ourselves. There's absolutely, we could never have created all of these things, and every single level, and it's within the people beyond our practice, but also within our practice. We have lots of teams who we always encourage everyone to be able to speak and have a voice, and we don't have a kind of like, we try and make it as level as possible, so no one feels shy to go, oh, actually, what about, how about this idea? I've got this, and we try and do group workshops together as much as we can. Obviously, time allowing, because usually, I'm sure you all agree, the clients give you 2 days to do everything.
Wow.
And it's like, quick. And actually, those quick brainstorming ideas is actually probably when the most creativity happens, because actually you're under pressure, you have to make decisions. And that's why the framework, the narrative is so important. It's like, okay, well, red clearly makes sense here as opposed to blue because of this story.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of these pieces come together. But I think it's the approach we have is actually making sure everyone feels comfortable to be able to talk, and it could be some random idea that, I saw this thing on the bus, do you think that could work? Come on, let's try it. And then off we go. But then it only works together when you have the framework, and I think the openness to allow other people to interject with their ideas.
Thank you. It's really interesting that the kind of narrative is what drives the aesthetic approach as opposed to the other way around, which I think is really, really interesting. Is there anything else you guys would like to say before we conclude?
I was just going to add to your point that I think to make a successful interior, you can't be the person who's brilliant at metal folding and brilliant at sandblasting and brilliant at casting concrete. You have to find the people who are amazing at that, and then you have to find the ones that have got quite an elastic way of approaching it, that they really understand that process inside out, and that you can find a new way of appropriating that process. That's definitely how all of our spaces have come together. We fabricate with people. We're not the makers of everything in there. Like, we're just kind of the umbrella story, and we find all the characters to help us realise it.
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you to our panel firstly for joining us, Maria, Paul, and Shai. Really appreciate you being here, and thank you to all for being here for this event, which is part of our Icon Mind series in partnership with Quadrifoglio. But yeah, round of applause.